There are a ton of CPUs available right now, and we're looking at the best CPUs for 2023, and this year is particularly confusing. In some ways, it's a good problem because that means there are a lot of options. The difference the past couple of years versus the many years prior is that last generation parts remain abundant right now alongside new components. This creates kind of an odd schism down the stack where there's clear good options, but from a last generation, so you're either buying into an end-of-life platform or hopefully you already own it and you're just kind of doing a drop and upgrade, and then the new stuff. So we're gonna be walking you through the best CPUs. We're looking at best overall. We'll be going over best gaming, which is a very simple category, talking about the best balance or best budget options, HDT options, and a category we particularly like, which is most power efficient. And we have to choose two CPUs because one of them is unattainably expensive. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Thermaltake swappable blade fans, available in 120 and 140 millimeter sizes. The new Thermaltake fans include 3 sets of swappable blades so that even as you change builds or cases, you can ensure the LEDs are always presented on their best side. The swappable blades allow builders to get the fan frame out of the way of the lights by reversing the blade direction to reconfigure the fan as push or pull while keeping the struts relatively hidden and keeping the fan frame oriented one way. Swapping blades is done by applying pressure evenly to opposite sides, then pressing until the click. Each fan also has pin-to-pad connections for cableless daisy chaining, and you can learn more at the link in the description below. So welcome back to our Best of Roundup series. We do these at the end of every year, and there's a lot to catch up on. To set the expectation for this particular video and all the other best of you'll see coming up, this is intended to get people up to speed as quickly as possible. We have run thousands of tests over the past year, and actually if you count the individual test passes, we're in the many tens of thousands at this point. We have looked at dozens of parts, and it's hard for us to keep track of. We have to constantly reference the data, and so the purpose of these videos is, one, to refresh ourselves on the data, but also get everybody who's been out of the market for a couple years back up to speed quickly, or even if you've followed it closely, just a reminder, because a lot of people will build their system, check out for a few years, come back in, and it's what happened. So that's what this is intended to help with, is to resituate you. If you want the individual in-depth reviews for any of the components we're talking about today, you can find those linked in the description below or search the channel for them. We will be including some charts to reinforce a couple of key points that we think are important, even if you're maybe not as much of an enthusiast user. But if you want all of the charts, you can go back and check through the individual reviews. We'll also have links to the processors on Amazon or Newegg. And the point here is to give a flyover and help you come to some conclusions quickly. So let's get started with our first category. The first award category is for the best overall CPU of 2023. This one goes handily to the AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D CPU, which has had price reductions down to around $360. This CPU is a double winner because it also takes our best gaming CPU category later. Because of that, for best overall, we'll focus mostly on the non-gaming aspects of the 78X3D. The 7800X3D is priced right around where high-end gaming CPUs long held pricing in the pre-i9 and R9 days, and therefore bringing chart-leading frame rate back to a more normal price point for a high-end machine. They're also single CCD solutions with only one size of core, kind of simplifying things. This makes scheduling easier, and it does streamline the setup as opposed to something like a dual CCD 7950X3D or in Intel's case a P-core E-core design, although those have matured over the years. The 7800X3D isn't a leader in production benchmarks like in Blender, but it's more than acceptable while still leading in gaming. There's a balanced category for CPUs that sit in the middle a little bit better later, but this one still does well in some of these categories, like Photoshop, for example. So the X3D CPUs can punch up depending on the workload. Another non-gaming contributing factor is the efficiency. The 7800X3D is an extremely efficient part and ranked right behind the new Threadripper parts that blew the doors open in this category. Because of the efficiency, it's also relatively easy to tame thermally. The power consumption in total is relatively low compared to sort of modern high-end CPUs. You don't need a 360mm CLC to cool the 7800X3D, reducing cost barrier to entry and opening up cooler options. The 7800X3D also particularly stands out for anyone trying to max out frame rate in gaming with a 7900XTX or an RTX 4090, where you really want to minimize the bottlenecks as much as possible. We'll come back to that in the gaming category though. The next category is for the most balanced CPU. This one goes to the i5 K-SKU CPUs, the 13600K or 14600K, depending on whichever is cheaper because they're basically the same. Or you can buy the KF to save a little more money and get rid of the IGP. The most balanced category is specifically a weighting of all tests we run for GN reviews, but also considering the price. This means we're factoring in the $270 price of a 13600K right now as we write this, as an example, which also makes it extremely competitive from that pricing value standpoint. We're also looking closely at that non-gaming performance. So even though the name is a generation old on the 13600K, the CPU isn't. It's perfectly good as a new chip, and it's balanced between price, gaming performance, and production performance. As an example, we found the 14600K scored 747 points in our aggregate Adobe Premiere benchmarks, putting it ahead of the 7800X3D and about tied with the 7700X. The CPU was likewise particularly competitive in our Blender rendering benchmark, where the pair completed in less time than the 7700X and 7800X3D. The 13.7 and 14.7 also do well here, but the pricing kind of puts them out of the best balanced category. Also, they're a little more power hungry. The gaming performance is also strong for the price, with our pre-patched Starfield numbers, which were all run with the same version of the game. We had them at 111 to 112 FPS for the i5s. It's behind the 78X3D, but with higher production workload performance in many, but not all cases, and a lower price, it is balanced. There are other examples. Baldur's Gate 3 performance is pretty good on the i5s. It puts them alongside the powerful 5800X3D. The 58X3D got a different award, but it doesn't get our balanced one, primarily due to that weaker production performance. While these i5 CPUs are not the most exciting or the best in any single category, they do fulfill an overall well-rounded performance and value profile. Next up is the award for Best Gaming CPU. This one goes to the AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D. The category is as basic as it can be. It considers only the absolute highest performing CPU in games we've tested. That means we're looking at CPUs for FPS snobs. While there are other options that'll get you 80% of the performance, those aren't considered here. That makes this one heavily numbers based. First, some basics for anyone who's been out of the market for a little while. The R7 7800X3D is a socket AM5 CPU that uses AMD's stackable cache, or V-cache, which we've found to have a large impact on gaming performance. It's an 8-core, 16-thread part with 96 megabytes of L3 cache, and it's currently around $360 at the time of filming, with occasional small discounts on Newegg and Amazon. It's down from $450 for its launch MSRP. Because this is a purely numbers-based category, let's look at some recent gaming benchmark charts. In the new Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty expansion that probably a lot of you will be playing during the holidays, the 7800X3D led the charts. It was about tied with the 7950X3D, although it carried better 0.1% lows. We've run the 7950X3D through this game several times now, and we found that it always encounters at least a couple sluggish frame times run to run, despite an overall good average, which is what contributes to that. We think this mostly has to do with scheduling. Either way, though, the 7800X3D is meaningfully ahead of everything here, and it's not even the most expensive sort of gaming-focused CPU on the chart. The 5800X3D would get you most of the way there as an upgrade, especially if you have AM4, but Intel's 14900K in this one leaves a relatively large gap to the 7800X3D, especially when you do consider the price. In Stellaris turn time simulation, the 7800X3D was roughly tied with the rest of the chart leaders. This one's measured in the time to complete the test. It's up there with the 14700K, 14900K, and 7950X3D, all of which are roughly within error of each other. Baldur's Gate 3 had the 7950X3D ahead on a technicality at 1080p, but it was ultimately within margin of error. You'll actually see in the next chart how close they are. The 7800X3D and 7950X3D both establish a relatively wide gap between themselves and the next CPU, which is the 4900K. Now, relatively here is the important word. It's not meaningful. You won't notice this gap, especially or particularly in this game, but if you glance at the rest of the chart, you'll notice a much more gradual sort of fall off of the blue bar down the chart. If you look at 1440p, you'll see that the 78X3D is still at the top. It retains all of its performance. It's the same as the 7950X3D, and that's in spite of an increase in GPU load. Finally, we'll show Starfield as a counterexample. This was before the most recent patches, so new numbers will be a little higher. But all of these were run on the same game version, so our tests here are directly comparable to each other, even though a game update will maybe boost the baseline. Intel kept a lead here. The 14900K was ahead of the 7800X3D by 15%. It's not always the best, but the 78X3D is the best often enough that it's our go-to for a high-end gaming machine. So Overall, this one gets our Best Gaming CPU award. Although the extra cache doesn't benefit this CPU in most of our production workloads, the core count allows it to remain a good overall option. If you're editing videos or running a lot of file compression and decompression workloads, the CPU does fine, especially if you're mostly gaming. This will most likely bottleneck you on a GPU if you don't go high-end enough. So to fully leverage the CPU, consider a higher-end GPU. We'd be looking in the RTX 4070 Ti or RX 7900 XT and up categories especially, although you could obviously pair it with anything. We recently revisited the RX 7900 XT on the channel, and the website as well has an article on gamersnexus.net if you want to see how that GPU does today versus some alternatives, and you can learn more about the 78X3D in our standalone review at the link below. Next up is for the best upgrade. We added this category last year. We're defining this as the best CPU that can drop into a board of a past generation, either Intel or AMD. But it's probably no surprise that the winner is the R7 5800X3D. And we hope that this encourages both AMD and Intel to continue offering good upgrade options in the future. It's fallen out of practice in the last decade or so, but it's great for consumers and often highly cost-effective for a stricter budget. Our recent Ryzen 2000 revisit showed just how much room there still is to bring AM4 forward, especially in gaming. The best part is that a lot of the boards from the prior Ryzen generations can support the X3D CPU already, although you should check the CPU support list for your board and update BIOS before pulling your old CPU. Many of the boards that support the R7 2700, the R5 3600, obviously the 5000 series CPUs, will run the 5800X3D without issues. And the fact that it's relatively low power for the performance means that even things like a moderate VRM will be able to keep up, as long as it's not too bad. Even some of the older R7 1700 era boards on X370 era chipsets can work, although it's a little more spotty for the BIOS support. If we look at a couple gaming charts from our 2700X revisit, you can see how you'll get a performance bump from those older CPUs that feels like a totally new PC build, especially if you're coupling it with a drop-in GPU upgrade, so you can save on the RAM, the motherboard, the case. Maybe you can keep the power supply, depends on how big you go on the GPU, but there's a lot of cost-saving options here. The 5800X3D is also relatively low power consumption for its performance. In an all-core workload, which is heavier than gaming, we had it at around 108 watts. That makes it easy to cool for a good $30 to $50 dual-tower air cooler, something like the Peerless Assassin. You can check our CPU cooler reviews for all that. It's almost good enough for a modern build too, but the board cost starts affecting value for a new system, and buying into DDR4 at this point just feels kind of bad because you are dead-ending yourself if you go that route. But options on eBay may open things up, and if you already have a bunch of DDR4, you go grab a $90 used board or something. We wouldn't necessarily recommend that route because this really makes the most sense as a drop-in upgrade for an existing build. It has a ton of cost savings, high performance upgrade, and if you can allocate some of that money that would have been spent on all new components towards a better CPU and GPU alone, then that might be the better option for you. Depends on how strict your budget is. The fact that AMD has kept the platform alive this long is commendable, and we hope to see this more going forward. The environmental impact and the e-waste impact is far lower, and the value for existing owners of the platform is strong. So, the 5800X3D gets our award for the best upgrade CPU this year. The next award is for the most efficient CPU. On the technicality of actually being the most efficient on the chart based on our testing, that goes to the Threadripper 7980X 64-core CPU when it's under an all-core workload. At $5,000 though, this CPU costs more than a full gaming PC and they're totally different markets, so we'll name the runner-up as well. That would be the R7 7800X3D, coming up again, with an honorable mention going to the R9 7950X in eco mode. We have some previous tests for that. They're not comparable to our newest power efficiency test because we've updated all the software since then, but it did post impressive results back when we tested eco mode. The 7980X though, that leads by a lot. In workstation applications that fully scale on 64 cores, the amount of time required to complete a given unit of work by the 7980X is impressive. In our efficiency chart, the 7980X posted a 12.9 watt-hour result, with the 7800X3D previously being the most impressive modern CPU, for gaming that is, outside of utilizing eco mode or being this HEDT part, although the 5950X remains a leader for its era. But that's what earns the 7800X3D the runner-up status. The 7980X goes a bit deeper though. We talked about this in our review, so to keep it short, the power utilization per core is exceptionally low due to the 0.84 to 0.85 volts V-core during all-core operation when capped with a 350-watt default PVT. These results, plus the multi-threaded efficacy in all-core applications, earn it the most efficient award. With the 7800X3D getting a sort of caveated note here that it would be among the most efficient, or often the most efficient, in frame rate per watt efficiency if you wanted to look at it that way, just because it runs a lot faster in games for frame rate than a 7980X does. Intel currently is way behind in all-core efficiency for desktop class parts. The 300-watt flagships are propping up the high-end CPU cooler market pretty well here. The next acknowledgement goes to best budget CPU, which is a really weird category this year. We normally target around the $150 to $200 price range. In the past, things like the 2600 have made sense here, or the 3600. This one was hard. There aren't many current generation options under $200. There's the R5 7600 non-X right around $200. Then the last gen R7 5700X. Intel has its i5 12600K around $140, and there's also an R5 7500F that isn't officially out in the West. The R5 5600 also was in our consideration here for its $130 to $140 pricing today, and all of this makes choosing difficult because it's not as clear anymore as just you're buying the newest thing no matter what. Now, in both CPU and GPU, there are current and prior generation options that make sense in different situations. We'll do this two ways. If you're one of the many people on AM4, but you can't afford a 5800X 3D upgrade, then the 5700X might be one of your best budget-friendly options to get one final upgrade. It has nearly identical performance to the 5800X non-3D, that is, in gaming, from the test we ran in our original 5700X review, but it tends to be cheaper. Where price is a hard limiter, it could be a worthwhile mid-step if you have to stop short of the 5800X 3D, and most people don't live near a micro center to benefit from a 5600X 3D. The 5600 makes less sense as an upgrade just because you'd have to be upgrading from pretty low on the stack and probably pretty far back in Ryzen, while also being budget constrained. So we'll give the best budget CPU for an upgrade option, at least, the 5700X, if you're keeping an old platform and you have to be cost constrained. As for something new, the R5 7600 really is worth considering. The Ryzen 7000 series launched with high pricing that reduced a lot of the initial appeal against prior generations. The 7600 is now at around $200. It's dropped about $30 from when it launched, and it's often within striking distance of the 7600X. If you're able to find a 7600X at the same price, you'll get a little bit more performance out of it because it is a little faster, but the TDP is lower on the 7600, so there's maybe some benefit there too. The next category is for the best high-end desktop CPU. For this, we don't mean the literal best, as in the biggest number, but instead what we think would provide a strong foundation for something like a video editing machine, a CPU-based rendering machine, or something dealing with Chromium-like compiles. We're naming the Threadripper 7970X here, and the only reason we added this CPU to this listing is because we're probably going to switch to it for some of our editing stations. It also did really well in spec workstation performance for its financial services benchmark, but that's not an area we're familiar with in a professional sense. We are very familiar with video, though. For our purposes, the 7980X isn't really viable. For video editing, well, Premiere has some known issues, although those sound like they're getting fixed at the moment, and additionally, it's just really expensive. But the 7970X posted excellent Adobe Premiere results in the Puget Bench, while also posting particularly strong raw video benchmark results and intra-frame benchmark results. In that sense, this is kind of a selfish pick. We're planning to build the 7970X machine for the office because based on our hands-on experience with it, we think it'd really help accelerate some of our video editing and rendering experiences. This next award isn't just for a budget CPU, but for the cheapest CPU that can still manage to play at least some games and is new. We're back with an award that's getting increasingly difficult to assign each year, as for best CPUs under $100, which goes to the Intel i3 12100F right now. We checked, and at the moment, the brand new CPU options under $100, and again new, are pretty slim. There's the i3 13100F, which is, first of all, not under $100 in the places we've checked. It's like 110 to 120, but that one's problematic, not just because it's over $100, but also because it's not that distant from the 12100F in performance, and there are better options that are not much more expensive than it. The R5 4600G is also around, but not competitive with the 12100F and its intended use case with a discrete GPU. There's also the R5 5500, but last time we reran that through the suite, we found its value was worse than the 1200F. The 1200F was also just a better performer, with boosts anywhere from 5% average FPS to 31% in games, or 2% to 35% at 1% lows. We had a lot of reservations about this type of FPS per dollar chart back when we showed it in the 13100 review, and we explained it there if you're curious why these charts are kind of difficult to perfectly use, but it does help illustrate a point. Using the pricing of the time, that had the 12100F as one of the best value CPUs available. A higher was better here. In an absolute sense, the i3 1200F is more than capable of playing a lot of games. It's not flashy. It's not going to work great with every game. That's the challenge with a cheap CPU. But in a lot of them, it's fine. F1 2022, for example, from our testing at the time, had it at 270 FPS average. It'll struggle in games probably like City Skylines 2, assuming you're not just completely bound up on the GPU, as we showed in our testing, or maybe Starfield with a similar caveat. But overall, for builds where you can't spend more money, and especially where you're playing what typically would be classified as quote-unquote esports games, this is a good starter option when financials are the bottleneck. It really helps to give some perspective on how good a cheap CPU can be for just the basics, and this really is an important category for PC parts. Every year, we have people comment about, well, if you just spend another $40. But for a lot of people, going from $100 to $140 is not a matter of just. It's a make or break for the build. Everyone has a price limit on their hobbies, and keeping the range as tunable as possible is good. But have no illusions about it. The 12100F will struggle in some games, and it won't age as well. That's the nature of spending as little as possible. But it does fall into the good enough category for a lot of games right now, and it does come in technically under $100. That also helps keep the board costs down. The last category is a classic of ours. It's for the biggest disappointment, and congratulations to Intel. They've won it. This year, the award goes to the entire 14th generation, and that's sort of the first clue. It's not a generational iteration. It is, however, a numerical one, which is fine, except there wasn't any meaningful uplift. The 14th series didn't do anything to advance performance in a way that mattered, but it at least briefly reset the prices. Now, the 13 and 14 CPUs have continued to shuffle around in price. We're completely okay with product refreshes. They should offer at least something. They don't have to go as far as the Steam Deck OLED did, where it's basically a new device, but a little bit more than change the number would be good. The 14700K added some cores, but even that didn't really help in a way that mattered. The 14 series just isn't interesting, and the temporarily high pricing was likewise unfortunate. It actually made Intel look worse than if people just paid more attention to the 13 series, for example, by tacking a number 50 to the end of it or something. That's why the 14 series gets the biggest disappointment award this year. So that's it for this one. Now, the pricing is just before Black Friday is actually happening. Depending on how much that affects pricing, you're going to see some numbers move around, and if things drop in price, which is what we're talking about, then that may affect how much we value a processor versus something else, of course. So you'll keep an eye out on prices, certainly as you're shopping, but based on the numbers we've given you from our data we have and the prices we have today, the decisions, for the most part, are pretty clear. A couple categories where it's less clear. So best budget, it's really not as straightforward as it used to be for us. It used to be as simple as like R5 2600, $200. Yep, that's definitely the winner. No questions about it, assuming it didn't win best overall or something for that year. But now it's difficult because some of the best CPUs are a prior generation, which feels a little weird to recommend now since they're EOL platforms. There's a lot of value in buying into a new one if the companies, well, AMD specifically, let's be honest here, do anything like AMD did with AM4. That's the one category where it was kind of difficult to nail down a single CPU, so we gave you the two options. But that covers it for the best CPUs. Again, you can find the full reviews in the description below, and those will get you the complete depth. This one hopefully got you up to speed quickly, so you can use it as a launching point to go do your next bit of research on the CPUs we've hopefully pointed you in the direction of. And we have other roundups coming up, so subscribe and check back regularly for all of that, of course. You can also go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us and our efforts with these pieces directly. Just a quick note, too. These are really fun to work on because, we lose sight of just how how many products ship in the computer hardware market over the course of a year. And there's a lot that aren't that interesting, but compiling the most interesting ones, plus one, in this case, group of disappointing ones, into a single video, it's a lot of fun, and it gets us back up to speed because there's so much going on. It's hard to stay on top of it all the time. So hopefully that helped you as well, and we're enjoying it. We'll do a couple more of these, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. See you all next time.